Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the state of Dubai's residential and commercial property markets, but really the main focus of my presentation is going to be on the risks and opportunities leading up to 2020 and beyond. I think before I get into the detail of all of that, I'd like a little show of hands across the room for how many people actually feel now is the right time to invest in Dubai's property market. Just a show of hands. Okay, and how many people think now is not the right time to invest in the Dubai property market? Very few. Okay, fine. Well, I hope to try and convince the few hands that went up for my second question that now is the right time to invest in the market. Before I do that, though, I'd like to kind of set the global economic backdrop. I think it's important to kind of think about the context in which we sit, the context in which we operate. If we were to try and think of a word to sum up the economy globally last year, I think we'd probably say things were quite uncertain. And I think if we were to think of a word this year to sum up the state of the world economy, we'd probably say things are even more uncertain. We've picked out three things that we think are quite crucial to the way in which the world economy is behaving at the moment. We've got the Brexit story playing out in the UK. Fortunately for us, the doom and gloom predictions of the UK slipping into a recession haven't actually materialized. The consumer spending has remained relatively resilient, which has helped economic growth in the UK. However, inflation is rising, as sterling has been a calamity of Brexit that has boosted exports. But in the evolving saga of the Brexit story, our Prime Minister has now called another general election. That is expected to slow GDP growth slightly, and it may impact on growth overall. But it is something that we definitely need to keep an eye on. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Trump presidency now approaching its 100 days in office. And again, fortunately or unfortunately for us, after trying his hand at improving domestic policy, he's now turned his attention to international politics. And it appears on a weekly basis that we have a new nation being targeted: Syria, North Korea, Iran this week. And I think those sorts of things really can undermine global stability. And at this point in time, anything that upsets global stability threatens to undermine global property markets. Closer to home, perhaps, and a very old story now, is the shock collapse in oil prices, which began 3 years ago. You're probably wondering why I'm talking about that in the context of Dubai. But Dubai is to the Middle East what London is to Europe. It's a gateway city. People who have jobs in Dubai often service markets around the region. Regional economies are slowing, they're contracting, and therefore, some of those high-end, top-level senior executive positions are being trimmed even in Dubai. Just to focus in a little bit on the state of the Dubai economy, I won't go into too much detail on all of those numbers, as we've heard a lot from Simon earlier on. But the forecast growth for GDP this year is at 3.1%. It's quite strong. It's going to be stronger than last year. And a lot of that growth is going to be driven by the investment in infrastructure that's going to come through as a result of the Expo 2020. As Simon alluded to earlier, there's 47 projects worth of infrastructure projects that's going to be awarded this year, amounting to about 11 billion dirhams, and that is going to create thousands of new jobs across the city. We've already seen Dubai's position as a city hub for FDI rising. It stood last year in 7th place globally on a city level. London was first. And so inward investment is coming in, and the Expo is certainly playing a very big part in that. Moving on then to the state of the market. We've talked for a couple of years about a slowdown in the residential and commercial markets, and things are very cyclical. However, more positively, we are starting to see signs perhaps of some stability as we approach the bottom of the current property cycle, both on the residential and commercial sides. I promise I haven't got very many graphs, but this first one behind me shows you the performance of residential capital values, both on a quarterly and an annual basis over the last 7 years. As you can see from the center of that graph, there was a tremendous spike in capital value growth during the summer of 2013. And for those of you that live in Dubai, you'll know that the results for the Expo City, the host city, was announced in November of 2013. A whole 6 months prior to that announcement taking place, sellers actually priced in a positive outcome for Dubai for whatever reason, and we saw a tremendous spike in growth there. In fact, capital values rose by 23% in a single quarter alone. Obviously, that wasn't sustainable, and it quickly got washed out of the market. And while at the end of the first quarter of this year, we've seen the weakest growth we've recorded in about 5 years, on a quarterly basis, things do appear to be stabilizing. At the top of the market is where we're actually seeing the biggest corrections. If I were to list out the top 5 weakest performing markets to the 12 months to the end of March this year, it'd be the Burj Khalifa, it'd be villas and apartments on the Palm Jumeirah, and it'd be the large villas in communities like the Arabian Ranches or Emirates Living. It really is that top end of the market that is feeling the biggest correction at the moment. Away from that, though, we do have some beacons of stability in the market. Lifestyle and affordability are 2 really important things in this city. Excluding the Burj Khalifa, if we were to look just at downtown Dubai, over the past 12 months or so, values haven't moved at all. That is in part driven by the fact that there are a very limited number of residential development plots available. And in fact, we've seen a 50% reduction in the number of units being brought to the market in downtown, which tells us that the opportunity to purchase properties for the first time directly from a developer are starting to diminish, which bodes quite well for the future of that market. Away from, what is perhaps one of the most expensive parts of the city, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of the city, places like International City or Discovery Gardens have also continued to outperform expectations. Values have held steady, and demand is holding strong, particularly from the investment community. That kind of asset is very limited in Dubai. We haven't got very much in the way of affordable housing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. The next graph I've got up here shows you our projections for residential supply through to 2020, both for villas and apartments. This was actually quite a big concern for us. As you can see, there's tremendous growth in the number of units coming through to the market. However, what we found is that a lot of this stock appears destined for the rental market, and it is obviously going to cause corrections there as supply moves ahead of demand. What's quite interesting is that there's been a lot of talk in the press about a fall in the volume of transactions taking place, but actually off-plan sales are doing really well. In fact, last year, off-plan sales accounted for 53% of all transactions in the city. And this is down to the fact that developers are offering enticing payment plans where you have to put down very little to secure a home, and often payment plans now stretch well beyond handover. Obviously, with all of this supply drifting onto the rental market, it's putting tenants in a very strong position, and this is a good thing. What is encouraging is that we're starting to see the emergence of rental portfolios, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from the CEO of Nikhil a bit later on. But the only time where we've actually ever seen institutional grade residential assets on the market was back in 2006 and 2007, where you had buildings in Discovery Gardens or International City that were fully tenanted and then sold as investment assets. We've seen some activity on that side, as Steve talked about before, on the commercial side in the market, but we've not really seen it take off on the residential side. And I think the creation of well-managed residential product by reputed developers in this market will actually start creating prized assets that will attract the global institutional investment that we've been talking about. Briefly looking at the state of the rental market, so that graph there shows you the performance of rents on average across the city over the last 7 years or so. You can see that at the end of the first quarter of 2017, rents were at a 5-year low, and as I've already said, tenant demand is weak, especially at the top of the market. We've talked a lot about the infrastructure spending that's going to come from the Expo, and actually we're yet to feel the impact of that. Standard Chartered released a study suggesting that some 300,000 jobs would be created directly as a result of the Expo between 2018 and 2021, and the vast majority of those new jobs would sit in Dubai. We are yet to see those coming through, but once they do, I think the rental market will start to turn around. Finally, looking very briefly at the state of the office market, the heat map behind me shows you all the locations that we track office rents for in the city. The only colors really to pay attention to on that are the red one, right in the middle of the city, and that represents the DIFC. So that is the only market in which we've actually seen a growth in office rents over the past 12 months. It's a very small market, there's a very limited amount of supply there, and actually organizations that wish to be based there are willing to pay to be there. The other interesting color which stands out on my heat map are the orange bubbles. those represent locations in which we've seen no movement in rents over the past 12 months. And actually, if you look down the left-hand side there of the chart, you'll see that all of those locations are actually free zones. New occupiers coming to Dubai are targeting free zones, and that's why rents there are actually holding up. We've heard a lot this morning from Simon and the panel about the future of the tech industry, and actually the technology, media and telecom sector has emerged recently as a star performer in the office market with unrelenting demand, and actually there's an insatiable appetite for free zone space, which in part is helping to support flat rents in those locations. Okay, so we understand that we are approaching the bottom of the market here, but what does the future hold for the Dubai property market? Where are things going leading up to 2020 and beyond? So over the next 4 slides, what I've got are 1 risk that we see in the market and 3 opportunities. I'll start with the risk, so I get the bad news out of the way. I think one of the biggest concerns for us at the moment is the introduction of value-added tax. This is, of course, part of a wide range of reforms being introduced across the Gulf as governments try to rebalance their economies, and I think it was long overdue. As we've seen in more mature markets, whenever there is a new tax introduced, it stalls the market. People take about 12 months to absorb the change. And I think for a market and for a region that has prided itself on being a tax-free haven, that is quite a sea change. In terms of property taxation, every GCC state is releasing details on it gradually. The market is being drip-fed with information. All we know for now is that residential property, when it's purchased first-hand directly from a developer, will be exempt from a 5% charge. However, all other property that's traded in the market will be subjected to a 5% value-added tax. That, of course, comes on top of the existing 4% property transfer fee, which actually pushes you up to 9% in terms of transaction costs. That is quite a big change for the market to absorb. It is likely to stall a recovery in the residential market. On the commercial side, there are discussions underway about charging all occupiers a 5% charge on top of their lettings rates that they pay for space. And in addition to that, there is also discussion of charging a 5% VAT on profits for all organizations that have a turnover of over $100,000 a year. So that's a lot to take in for the market. And as I say, it's a change of the way in which business is being done here. It is a big risk. It's likely to stall things for a while, but it is positive that the change has happened. Looking on to more positive things, so we've talked about the Expo, we've talked about the billions of dollars worth of contracts that are coming through, we've talked about the hundreds of thousands of new jobs that are going to be created. I think in Dubai, we all understand that the vast majority of property that's brought to the market targets the luxury, high end of the market. When these jobs are being created, however, like anywhere else in the world, it will be a jobs pyramid. So the vast majority of demand will be in the middle to lower income segment of the market. And at the moment, we have very little in the way of residential product to satisfy that demand. On average, annual household incomes in the UAE for expat families stands at roughly 200,000 dirhams a year. Looking at a mortgage multiplier of 3 or 4 times that, you're talking about 600,000 to 800,000 dirhams for a family home. And actually, there is almost nothing available right now outside International City or Discovery Gardens that is being built to target that market. I understand a lot of development is taking place where developers are badging their product as affordable, but in reality, when you look at the numbers, it doesn't quite stack up yet. So that is a tremendous opportunity both for developers in the region and from overseas to come in and cater to that demand. As I mentioned earlier, the TMT sector is booming at the moment. The government, I think, is playing a huge part in that. In this market, which is so sentiment-driven, when you have the government committing itself to things like the Dubai Future Foundation, which is an incubator space for things like Hyperloop, which intends to revolutionize transport and move people around at 1,200 kilometers per hour, it's not just talk. Hyperloop is going to have a 20-kilometer test track ready to debut at the Expo in 3.5 years' time. So the future is happening now. In addition to that, you've got the UAE space program, which was recently launched by the government. The UAE wishes to put a satellite around Mars by 2020. And even beyond that, the UAE has now set an ambitious target to have the first human settlement on Mars in the next 100 years. It's not a question about whether or not these targets are achieved, but it's about the government setting a target that people buy into. People believe in it, and therefore it fosters growth. And I think in terms of an opportunity, there is a huge opportunity here for developers to actually build purpose-built space, incubation spaces that actually cater to what will essentially be the next engines of growth for the economy here as it starts to mature. And finally then, we've got billions of dollars worth of projects underway in the city. Some $600 billion worth of projects announced or under construction in Dubai at the moment. I've picked out a few highlights there. We've got Al Maktoum International Airport, which will be expanded at a cost of $32 billion, making it the world's largest airport when it opens in the mid to late 2020s. And it'll have a passenger capacity of greater than Heathrow and Gatwick combined. We're talking 260 million people plus. You've also got the Deira Islands by Nakheel, which has recently had a contract for over $1 billion awarded for the next largest mall in Dubai. Around that, Nakheel plans to build 3,000 residential units in 20 towers, which will cost another $1 billion. You've got Mohammed bin Rashid City, which will have projects worth $60 billion underway, which will have the world's largest freshwater crystal lagoon. You've got Dubai Creek Harbour, which of course will house the world's tallest man-made structure, topping out at over 1,000 meters, again being built at a cost of $1 billion. You've got the Mall of the World being built at a cost of $7 billion, which will change the way in which we live and we shop and work. And I think on this final slide of mine, the point I wanted to make is that it's very easy to get sidetracked when you're looking at the way in which Dubai is growing. I think it's very important to take a step back and understand the government's wider vision and how all the pieces fit together in this very complex puzzle. The government has set an ambitious target of making this city the most visited one in the world by 2020. If you look at the figures that have been released at the Arabian travel market this week, we've had over 5 million tourists come in during the first quarter of this year. So we're already going to hit that 20 million target well before the expo even arrives. The economy is maturing here, and plenty of opportunities are emerging. And I think this really is a good time to be investing in this market. So I'm hoping that I've convinced the 3 or 4 hands that went up earlier that now is the right time to be investing in this market. Thank you.